Mike Tyson's pregnant wife waits outside a bakery, minding her own business. But her peaceful moment is shattered when a racist cop approaches, accusing her of loitering. She stands her ground, refusing to be intimidated. That's when he snaps, his boot slamming into her side, sending her crashing to the ground. Just then, Mike Tyson pulls up, his eyes immediately locking onto the scene. Fury erupts inside him. His fists, like weapons forged in anger, fly. He demolishes the officer with brutal precision, his rage uncontainable. The cop crumples, helpless, begging for mercy. But Mike isn't done. He leans in close, voice cold as steel. "Never touch my family again." The scene freezes in time. The cop, lying defeated, knows he's learned the hardest lesson. Subscribe and like this video to see how the story unfolds. The late afternoon sun, like a benevolent hand, gently spread its warmth across the horizon. But for one man, the heat of justice had already burned him. Over the downtown streets, the late afternoon sun cast a golden blanket of light, bathing the city in a serene harmony. The day felt almost idyllic, as if the world itself had paused to revel in the beauty of the hour. Amidst the meandering, carefree crowd was Julia Tyson, a vision of pregnancy and maternal radiance. Her glow lit up the busy streets like a beacon. Her belly, swollen with the promise of new life, stood as a testament to the deep love she shared with her husband, the legendary Mike Tyson. With a tenderness only a mother could know, Julia cradled a brown paper bag in her hands, brimming with the warm, buttery croissants pressed softly against her body as Julia moved gracefully toward the park bench. As she settled herself comfortably onto the wooden seat, a small, involuntary gesture unfolded. Her hand gently rested on the blossoming life within her. It was a tender, intimate touch, one that spoke of love and the promise of motherhood. Then, with a subtle yet unmistakable shift beneath her hand, a tiny foot pressed gently against her palm, a delicate declaration of the little one's vitality. With a sigh of relief, Julia Tyson stretched out her weary legs, feeling the cool breeze brush against her skin as her swelling belly, no doubt a testament to the rigors of pregnancy, seemed to glow under the soft light of the afternoon. For that fleeting moment, Julia basked in the rare ease of the day. She reached into her pocket, poised to send a simple message to Mike, letting him know she was waiting patiently. But before she could press send, the serene atmosphere was shattered by the shrill, discordant screech of tires. A cold shiver ran through her veins, even as the warmth of the afternoon sun still kissed her skin. The bakery, once a refuge filled with comforting scents and mouth-watering confections, was now transformed into the epicenter of chaos, a flash of movement cutting through the tranquility. The point of conflict arrived like a storm on the horizon, the screech of tires as the ominous police cruiser skidded to a halt. The air around Julia thickened, charged with tension. From the vehicle emerged Officer Ray Saunders, his towering figure and sharp buzz cut amplifying the menace that seemed to radiate from him. His cold, piercing blue eyes glinted with a dangerous, predatory gleam, like an apex hunter sensing its prey. Saunders' gaze swept over the surroundings, a beast scanning its territory. Then, it locked onto Julia, and in that instant, his face twisted into a sneer of disgust. Emboldened by years of unchecked power and authority, Saunders had long grown accustomed to treating the world as though it owed him something. His sense of superiority was a dangerous thing, rooted deep in arrogance and disdain for anyone he deemed beneath him. Through the distorted lens of bigotry and deep-seated discrimination, Officer Saunders viewed the world in ways few could comprehend. To him, a beautiful, affluent black woman sitting alone in a neighborhood he believed too exclusive for someone like her was a glaring anomaly, a discordant note in what he perceived as the perfect harmony of his community. His mind, warped by years of prejudice, immediately concluded that she did not belong. Her mere presence was an affront to his twisted sense of superiority. With the swagger of a tyrant who had long lived above reproach, Saunders approached Julia. Each step felt like a thunderclap, the ground seeming to tremble beneath the weight of his arrogance, as though the earth itself recognized the threat he posed. His footsteps grew louder, each one a deliberate strike of intimidation. "Hey, you!" he barked, his voice a jagged weapon meant to wound, to belittle. Julia, caught off guard by the sudden aggression, flinched ever so slightly, her body tensing as her eyes frantically searched for the source of his hostility. In a protective instinct, her hand curled instinctively around her swollen belly, as if to shield the life growing within her from this stranger's venom. Confusion and anxiety collided within her as she raised her gaze. Her eyes met the towering figure of Officer Saunders, the weight of his presence pressing down on her like a storm cloud. "Yes?" she asked, her voice shaky, laced with uncertainty, a vulnerability that stood in stark contrast to his menacing stance. Her confusion was unmistakable, her voice trembling with the shock of being thrust into this cruel interaction. Saunders, however, wasted no time. The disdain in his eyes was palpable, an almost tangible force that hung between them. His words landed like hammer blows, shattering the fragile peace she had been basking in. "You can't sit here. Move along," he ordered, each syllable thick with venom, a command that felt like a slap. His voice was cold, dripping with contempt, as if her mere presence offended him. The air around them seemed to tense, thickening with confusion and mounting unease. Julia, her mind spinning in disbelief, could hardly process the hostility that had suddenly descended upon her. With furrowed brows, she lifted her head, her eyes searching for some sign of logic behind this confrontation. "Excuse me?" she responded, her voice wavering, betraying the confusion flooding her thoughts. Her words were soft, but they carried an underlying plea, a desperate attempt to make sense of the irrationality that now clouded the moment. "I'm just waiting for my husband." Her tone was a mix of bewilderment and vulnerability, the calmness of the afternoon now entirely shattered. She felt as if she were drowning in the absurdity of the situation, as if she had just stepped into a world where logic and fairness no longer existed. She was simply a woman, waiting for the man she loved. Was that so wrong? But Officer Saunders remained unyielding, his eyes locking onto Julia with a chilling intensity, his gaze like icy daggers piercing through the very fabric of her being. The air seemed to thicken with his disdain as he opened his mouth, each word dripping with venomous condescension. "Your husband?" he scoffed, his voice thick with disbelief, as if the mere notion was laughable. The skepticism and contempt in his tone were unmistakable, a mask for his growing arrogance. "What, you think you can just loiter around here? You people are always looking for handouts." His words cut deep, sharper than any physical blow. His twisted perception of reality, poisoned by years of unchecked prejudice, had completely distorted his view of the situation. He saw her not as a woman waiting for her husband, but as an embodiment of everything he despised, a threat to his fragile worldview. The tendrils of his bias, sharpened by a lifetime of hatred, had clouded his judgment completely, turning every innocent action into something malicious. The air felt heavy, as if time itself was holding its breath in the face of his words. Julia could feel the weight of his hatred pressing against her, suffocating, relentless. A surge of anger began to twist through Julia's mind, each pulse of rage fueling the fire within her. Her jaw clenched, teeth gritted against the injustice that cut through her very core. The situation was grotesque, a sickening display of power gone unchecked. Her chest tightened, but there was no retreat. "Sir, I'm not loitering," she snapped, her voice now sharp and unwavering. "I just bought something from the bakery." The words came out not as an apology, but as a firm declaration, a clear statement of her innocence. "I have every right to sit here." Her tone, once tentative and soft, now rang out with the force of a battle cry, as if each word was a shield, each syllable an armor against the officer's oppressive force. Her dignity stood tall, refusing to bow to the weight of his prejudices. She wasn't going to let him rob her of her self-respect. For a brief moment, A faint glimmer of a sinister smile flickered across Officer Saunders' lips, a cruel twitch that betrayed his sense of satisfaction. He watched her defiance with growing amusement, as if the young woman's bravery only stoked the fire of his twisted power. The smile deepened, an unsettling sign of how little he cared for the truth or the pain his actions were inflicting. He reveled in the struggle, as if it confirmed everything he had come to believe about his dominance over others. Embers of his resentment sparked into full-blown fury. "Did I just hear you talk back to me?" Officer Saunders snarled, his voice growing taut with malevolence. His hand twitched toward the baton at his side, the weapon a silent promise of the violence coiled beneath his skin, just waiting for the slightest provocation to be unleashed. Julia felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as a chill ran through her veins. This wasn't just an officer doing his job. It was an angry predator closing in. Her heart pounded, the beat loud in her ears, but she refused to let fear completely overtake her. She shook her head in disbelief, unable to comprehend the sheer audacity of his actions. "I'm not causing any trouble," she protested, her voice trembling but growing steadier with every word. The weight of her words hung in the air, desperate but resolute. "I'm pregnant, for God's sake." Her revelation should have been a plea, a final attempt to humanize herself in his eyes, to remind him of the life she carried, of the innocence of her situation. But it fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the rising crescendo of his simmering anger, the oppressive weight of his authority. His glare hardened, each word that came out of his mouth dripping with venom, and Julia could feel the growing distance between her humanity and the monster before her. Officer Saunders' twisted sense of authority surfaced in full force, his sneer morphing into a grotesque parody of a smile. The hate in his eyes flared, transforming into something almost joyous, as though he reveled in the chance to belittle and degrade. "Oh, so now you're playing the victim card," he jeered, his voice dripping with venom. The words slithered from his mouth, a spiteful twisting of the truth, designed to dismantle Julia's credibility, to tear apart her very sense of reality. The weight of his contempt was so thick it seemed to stifle the air around them, leaving her questioning if everything she knew, everything she felt, was being warped into something unrecognizable. Like a venomous snake striking at its prey, Officer Saunders' boot shot out, a sudden violent motion aimed at Julia. The force of it felt like a crack of thunder in the silence, the cruel intent clear in every move. He wasn't just challenging her, he was breaking her down, piece by piece. A blur of black leather and sadistic intent, Officer Saunders' boot came down with terrifying precision. The sole of his boot slammed into Julia's ribs with brutal force, the sickening crack of the impact echoing through the park. The sound was almost too much to bear, as if the very air trembled with the violence of it. Julia was thrown violently to the side, her body crashing to the ground with a sickening thud, her cries of agony swallowed by the sheer brutality of the blow. The force of the kick sent shockwaves through the park, a stark reminder of the unchecked power Saunders wielded, a power he wasn't afraid to abuse. Julia's scream, raw and desperate, ripped through the air like a sonic boom, a primal expression of pain and terror. The sound crashed over the onlookers, shaking them to their core, sending a ripple of shock and disbelief through the crowd. The pregnant woman, her body trembling and vulnerable, lay crumpled on the cold concrete, her breath shallow, each one a painful reminder of the violence she had just endured. The world seemed to crumble around Julia, a swirling vortex of agony and fear. She toppled from the bench, her body instinctively curling protectively around the fragile life growing inside her. The brown paper bag, once a symbol of simple joy and promise, was now a casualty of the violence, its contents spilling across the sidewalk in a cruel, mocking display. The warm, buttery croissants, now trampled and broken, seemed to reflect the shattering of Julia's innocence, an image of life's fragility, torn apart in an instant. And then, as if driven by the deep, primal need to protect a fellow woman in distress, a stranger surged forward. Her feet pounded against the pavement, the desperation of her sprint palpable in every stride. Reaching Julia's side, she dropped to her knees beside her, her hands trembling as they reached out in an attempt to comfort the fallen woman. The kindness in her gesture was an act of solidarity, a stark contrast to the cruelty that had just unfolded, a glimmer of humanity amidst the chaos. The wounded woman, barely able to breathe through her pain, felt a sudden surge of compassion from the stranger who knelt beside her. "Are you okay?" The words rushed out of the woman's mouth, raw and frantic, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and an undeniable resolve. This woman, a complete stranger just moments ago, seemed to grasp, without question, the injustice that had just been unleashed on Julia. In that fraught instant, their worlds collided, their hearts connecting through the shared recognition of the brutality they had witnessed. It was a silent understanding, unspoken but undeniable, as if their souls had somehow found each other in the chaos of the moment. And then, like a dam unable to hold back the tide, tears welled up in Julia's eyes. They rolled down her cheeks, the warm saltiness of them a sharp contrast to the cold, bone-chilling violence of Officer Saunders' attack. Her hand, trembling, instinctively pressed against her swollen belly, a shield against any further harm, a desperate plea to protect the life growing inside her. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding in a frenzied whirl of panic, disbelief, and an aching primal fear. Could she protect her baby from this world that seemed determined to hurt her? Despite the overwhelming pain gnawing at her insides, Julia's heart clung to the faintest shred of hope as she felt the delicate movements of the life within her. A small, fragile reassurance that the worst had not yet come to pass. But even that fleeting comfort couldn't quench the burning agony that radiated from her body. A cruel reminder of the violence she had just suffered. The pain was sharp, unrelenting, a mark of the brutality she had been forced to endure. Above her, Officer Saunders loomed, his figure a shadow of menace standing over her crumpled form. His twisted smirk stretched into a grotesque grin, an unsettling expression of dark satisfaction. He relished the moment, his gaze drinking in the destruction he had caused. "Maybe next time you'll learn some respect," he jeered, his voice thick with sick, sadistic glee. His words cut through the air like a knife, meant not to educate but to wound, to humiliate. It was as if he were teaching a lesson to an unruly child, not a grown woman suffering in agony. His cruelty was as palpable as the oppressive heat, and it hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. The scene was a chilling tableau of innocence crushed under the weight of brutality. Officer Saunders, his boots stained with the remnants of his violence, stood planted firmly, a grotesque symbol of the corruption festering deep within his soul. His very stance seemed to anchor him to the injustice he had just delivered, as if the darkness had seeped into his very being. Then, as if the world itself had reached the breaking point, time seemed to still. The air held its breath. In an instant, a black SUV tore through the silence, its tires screeching against the pavement in a desperate, screeching protest. The vehicle slid to a halt in the middle of the street, its dark silhouette casting an ominous shadow over the scene, as if some malevolent figure had materialized from the very bowels of the earth itself. The driver's door flung open with a sharp metallic clang, and from the depths of the vehicle emerged Mike Tyson. His presence was an immovable force, radiating an energy that seemed to crack the air around him. Like a storm breaking the calm, every step he took toward the chaos pulsed with a raw, unstoppable intensity, a power that promised retribution. A palpable menace clung to the air, thick and suffocating, as though the very atmosphere recoiled from the impending conflict. The scene had become a tinderbox. Every small moment, every flicker of tension, had been quietly building toward this explosive end. And Mike Tyson's arrival was the spark that ignited it, transforming the air around them into a smoldering inferno of fury and reckoning. The pedestrians, who moments before had been nothing more than passive onlookers, now stood frozen. Their eyes, wide with disbelief and anticipation, reflected the gravity of the moment. A collective understanding rippled through the crowd as if they all knew what was about to unfold, yet couldn't tear their gaze away. They were paralyzed, like spectators in a Roman arena waiting for the inevitable clash, knowing something monumental was coming, but unable to escape it. The crowd held their breath, knowing they were about to witness a clash of titans unfold before their very eyes. In the split second it took for Mike Tyson's eyes to sweep across the scene, a transformation occurred. One that would have seemed impossible to anyone who only knew him as a world-class boxer, a ferocious force of nature in the ring. His gaze first landed on his crumpled wife, Julia, her pain slicing through him like a hot knife. His heart shattered in that instant, a deep, visceral ache surging through his chest. And then, with a deliberate calmness, his piercing stare zeroed in on Officer Saunders, whose smug grin cut through the chaos like a beacon of arrogant defiance. Mike's breathing slowed, measured, and deep. His chest rose and fell with the kind of calm intensity that only came from years of discipline, of knowing exactly when and how to unleash the storm inside. His presence became a force, silent but suffocating. In that moment, nothing else existed in the world but his gaze and the man who had made the tragic mistake of crossing the line. Mike Tyson moved with a measured pace, like a hunter stalking its prey, the predatory silence only amplifying the tension in the air. His presence was commanding, a silent promise of violence coiled beneath the surface. His swagger, once a symbol of confidence, now felt like the calm before the storm. Officer Saunders, still standing, turned to face the approaching threat, but the sight of Tyson, his gaze unflinching, his steps deliberate, stole the very breath from his lungs. His mouth went dry as he tried to find his voice, his words faltering, stumbling over themselves in his sudden fear. "Step back, sir, unless you—" But before the officer could finish the threat, Tyson was upon him. In the blink of an eye, his movements blurred with a speed that left no time for reaction. His arms shot out with precision, a blur of muscle and fury, closing the distance in an instant. Mike's hands coiled around Officer Saunders' uniform like iron bands, a grip so tight it seemed to crush the very fabric of authority the cop once held. The crowd's collective gasp reverberated through the street, a discordant symphony of shock and awe. Even the onlookers, those who had anticipated this moment for so long, were stunned by the sheer speed and precision with which Tyson had moved. His body, moving with the grace of a panther and the strength of a gorilla, was a lethal combination that seemed almost otherworldly. "You just kicked my wife." Tyson's voice was low, a growl that vibrated through the air, but it carried an unmistakable edge of fury. His grip tightened further, like a vice, a silent threat that spoke louder than words ever could. In that frozen moment, his eyes locked with Officer Saunders. It was as if time itself had stilled. A silent promise passed between them, an unspoken covenant, that this was no longer about authority or power, but about something far more primal. Sealed in the heat of primal fury, Officer Saunders stammered for words, his arrogance crumbling like brittle glass under the weight of Tyson's rage. The legendary boxer wasted no time. A savage brutality surged through him as the air thickened with the power of his presence, rendering Saunders' fumbling words meaningless. They hung there, limp and irrelevant, swallowed up by the deep, guttural sound of knuckles smashing into flesh. With the suddenness of a lightning strike, Tyson's right hook connected with Officer Saunders' ribs. The impact was like a freight train crashing into a flimsy wall, raw, unrelenting, and utterly unstoppable. The force of the blow lifted Saunders' body off the ground, sending him sprawling like a rag doll caught in a violent storm. A runaway train. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the air like a sonic boom, signaling the violent shattering of Officer Saunders' bravado. He was thrown to the ground, his breath stolen by the sheer intensity of Tyson's righteous retribution. Saunders lay there, gasping, unable to process the flood of pain coursing through him. In the aftermath of Tyson's ferocious assault, the crowd exploded into a cacophony of emotion. A kaleidoscope of reactions rippled through the onlookers, painting a picture of both horror and awe. A collective gasp ran through the gathering, like a single breath held in unison. Some recoiled in disbelief, their faces pale with shock, while others trembled, their nerves crackling with a nervous energy that mirrored the tension hanging thick in the air. The chaos of the scene reverberated through the crowd. There were gasps, murmurs, and the crackling tension of disbelief. But among them, a few voices rose, thunderous in their approval. They cheered, their chants echoing through the street, a primal roar heralding the end of Officer Saunders' reign of terror. The crowd had witnessed the moment they'd been waiting for, and their support was as undeniable as Tyson's fury. Officer Saunders, still dazed by the shockwave of Tyson's assault, struggled to rise. His arms flailed weakly, his movements sluggish, as he tried desperately to push himself off the pavement. But his feeble efforts were swept aside like dust in the wind by the swift, merciless hand of justice. With the grace of a jungle predator, Mike Tyson descended upon him. In one fluid motion, he seized the officer's collar, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. The crowd held its breath, the air thick with anticipation, as the fate of the once proud officer hung by a thread. Officer Saunders' feet dangled in the air, his body now weightless in the hands of the enraged boxer. The crowd stood frozen, the silence heavy, broken only by the deep rumble of Tyson's voice, a guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate through the very air itself. Each word that left his lips carried a primal savagery, a threat wrapped in the promise of wrath. "You like hurting people?" Tyson bellowed, his voice booming with intensity, his face inches from Saunders. The heat of his breath washed over the officer, a searing reminder of what was coming next. "How about I show you what pain feels like?" His words were more than a threat. They were a warning. The grip on Officer Saunders' collar tightened, Tyson's knuckles digging into the fabric with a force so brutal it felt like a vice, each inch closer to breaking the man's spirit. Ray's desperation was palpable, his body trembling under the overwhelming weight of Tyson's fury. Officer Saunders, desperate to reclaim even the slightest shred of his fading authority, reached for the one symbol of control he still held, his baton. His fingers, trembling with panic, closed around the cold metal. But it was a futile attempt. His hand moved like the last desperate twitch of a fly caught in the claws of a bear. Before he could even raise it, his arm was seized mid-motion by the unforgiving grip of Mike Tyson's left hand. The cop's scream cut through the air, a harrowing, raw chorus of pain and defeat that echoed down the silent street, reverberating in the hearts of onlookers. It was a mournful lament, not just for the pain he was enduring, but for the utter loss of his power. Tyson's hand twisted with unrelenting precision and brutal force, a single movement that sent a sickening crack through the officer's wrist. It buckled under the weight of the legendary fighter's strength, and in that moment, Officer Saunders' authority was shattered completely. His body, a mere tool in the hands of the man he had wronged. With a metallic clatter, the baton, now bereft of its wielder, tumbled to the pavement, its fall a poignant symbol of the cop's shattered pride. The weapon, once an instrument of his authority, now lay useless and forgotten, a silent testament to the collapse of his power. The taste of vengeance lingered on Tyson's tongue, a bitter yet satisfying morsel that only stoked the fires of his fury. The world seemed to slow around him, every beat of his heart a drum of retribution, fueling his wrath even further. With the precision of a surgeon and the force of a tempest, Tyson unleashed his rage in a devastating uppercut. His fist connected with Officer Saunders' gut with brutal, calculated force, burrowing deep like a hammer striking soft earth. The sound of the impact was sickening, a meaty thud that rang in the ears of every onlooker. Officer Saunders' body, once stiff with bravado, crumpled beneath the weight of Tyson's unrelenting power, collapsing like a building under siege. Tyson's assault had broken Officer Saunders completely. His knees buckled like a house of cards, his breath heaving from his lungs in violent bursts, as if the air itself were fighting to escape his battered body. It was as if the gods themselves had passed judgment, and Tyson stood as their unrelenting emissary. Mike Tyson loomed over Officer Saunders, a towering figure of righteous fury, yet his voice was disturbingly calm amidst the storm of his wrath. His words were cold, each one measured and deliberate, carving themselves into the cop's shattered psyche like the blunt edge of a chisel. "You don't hit women," Tyson intoned, his voice low but carrying an intensity that sent a shiver down the spine of anyone within earshot. "You never touch a pregnant woman, and you damn sure don't touch my wife." Officer Saunders, a once proud figure of authority, was now a broken shell of a man, his body a shattered husk, wriggling on the ground like a worm exposed to the sun. His bravado had evaporated, replaced with the raw desperation of a man who knew he was beyond redemption. Officer Saunders's pleas were as pathetic as the scrape of a wounded animal, desperate and futile. "Please, His words faltered, choked by the acrid taste of defeat, hanging in the air like the stench of his own humiliation. A desperate cry for mercy, but it went unanswered, swallowed whole by the suffocating silence that enveloped the street. A silence thick with his shame. Tyson's movements were deliberate, as smooth and calculated as a predator closing in on its prey. With a calmness that was almost eerie, he sank to one knee, bringing himself eye level with the broken officer. His gaze was sharp, piercing through the veil of weakness before him like an X-ray, reading every layer of the man's fear, his guilt, and his broken spirit. Tyson's voice came low, barely more than a growl, dripping with disdain. He leaned in, his breath hot against the officer's ear as he taunted him. "Begging already?" Didn't take long. Each word Tyson spoke was a punctuation mark on the officer's sentence, laced with contempt and righteous fury. The crowd, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, stood frozen in a tableau of rapt attention. Some, their eyes alight with a savage thrill, erupted in cheers, cries of jubilation that rang out like a chorus of vindication for the officer's countless victims, both past and present. Others, their hands trembling around their smartphones, clutched them tightly, capturing every moment. They recorded the scene, preserving the instant when retribution was finally delivered, when justice, raw and unrelenting, had been met. Out in a brutal and cathartic display of justice, the shrill wail of sirens cut through the air, a haunting melody of impending doom, like the scream of a banshee foretelling reinforcements for the shattered officer. The second patrol car screeched to a halt, its tires protesting the violent stop. Two officers, drawn by the reverberating sound of chaos, leapt from their vehicle, adrenaline surging through their veins. But even the most battle-hardened law enforcer would hesitate when faced with the fury of the legendary Mike Tyson. The younger officer, his heart hammering in his chest like a horse released from the gate, found his legs frozen, his training slipping away in the face of Tyson's unrelenting presence. The younger officer, heart pounding, cautiously approached the scene, his eyes flicking nervously between the defeated cop and the imposing figure of Mike Tyson. With his palms raised in a gesture of peace, he spoke, his voice a fragile balance between professionalism and awe. "Mr. Tyson," he began, each word deliberate, almost hesitant. "What happened here?" Tyson's finger, like a jagged spear, shot forward, piercing the air with an unspoken accusation. His voice rumbled with the weight of fury, low and unrelenting, as if each word carried the force of a storm about to break. "This guy here," Tyson growled, his voice thick with rage, "kicked my pregnant wife." The words hung in the air, a brutal indictment of the officer's actions, and the younger cop felt the full weight of Tyson's fury press upon him. It wasn't just a claim, it was a thunderous declaration of justice. The younger officer's gaze flicked between Tyson and the fallen cop, his eyes widening as the magnitude of the situation sank in. The crowd of bystanders surrounding Julia, her fragile form still curled in pain, only intensified the horror of the scene. The very air seemed to thicken with the weight of the injustice. A chill ran through the officer as his professional mask began to crack, replaced by something deeper, something more human. His spine straightened, shoulders stiffened, as if the brutality he had just witnessed had shaken him to his core. His eyes turned to Officer Saunders, no longer a man of authority, but a broken figure, slumped in shame. The younger officer's voice, cold as steel, cut through the tension, carrying a quiet yet undeniable force. "Saunders," he spat, the name an accusation in itself. His words struck with the weight of inevitability. "You're under arrest." The words rang out, a solemn death knell for the officer's career, echoing across the scene like the final verdict in a trial of life and death. The crowd, stunned into silence, could feel the weight of the moment. Justice, cold and uncompromising, was finally being served. The moment hung heavy in the air, an irreversible judgment, the kind that would forever stain Officer Saunders' record and haunt him long after the dust had settled. His protest, a feeble cry of arrogant defiance, rang hollow, like the pitiful whining of a trapped animal scrambling to escape its fate. What? He sputtered, his voice cracking, his face contorting into a grotesque caricature of its former self. The evidence of Tyson's unrelenting fury was written across every swollen feature. No! He attacked me! His words, weak and desperate, fell on deaf ears. The younger officer, now a silent arbiter of justice, could not be swayed. His eyes were cold, unreadable, as his hand swept the handcuffs from his belt. There was no hesitation in the motion, no trace of doubt. It was not just duty that guided him now, but a deeper, unspoken understanding of right and wrong. The officer's every movement embodied a reluctant resolve, a duty not just to his badge, but to something far more important, to the victims of the very corruption that had tainted Officer Saunders' soul. The cuffs clicked into place with finality. Stern professionalism laced the younger officer's voice, his calm certainty leaving no room for debate. "We have the footage," he said, gesturing toward the still rolling cameras, his words heavy with the weight of irrefutable evidence. The truth was an unshakable force, and in this moment, Saunders could not escape it. "And given your history," the officer continued, his tone slicing through the tension like a sharpened blade, "let's just say no one's going to believe your story." The words hit harder than any physical blow, a cruel reflection of reality that served as a mirror to Ray Saunders' abhorrent actions. They were a testament to the consequences of his vile choices, the inevitable unraveling of his reign of terror. The truth, like an unstoppable tide, had washed over him, and now there was no escaping the fallout. Like a puppet on strings, Officer Ray Saunders was dragged to his feet, his body racked with pain. His face twisted into a grimace of agony, his pride shattered beyond repair as the weight of his failures settled in. Bruises bloomed across his flesh, a dark and painful canvas of his sins. Cuffed and shackled, Ray Saunders was led away, his legs barely able to carry him, a hollow shell of the man he once believed himself to be. His once imposing presence had been crushed beneath the weight of his own hubris, leaving only the echo of his arrogance. As he was marched toward the police cruiser, a desperate glance shot over his shoulder. His eyes, wide with fear and regret, sought out the monumental figure of Mike Tyson. But Tyson remained unmoved, standing as a silent, unyielding pillar of retribution. Saunders' eyes pleaded for mercy, the kind of mercy that would never come. His actions had sealed his fate, and no amount of regret could undo the violence he had inflicted. The violence had been brief, its physical toll a flash of brutality, but its impact rippled through the city streets, a tidal wave of consequences that would wash away the remnants of his power and pride. The storm had passed, but its aftershocks would be felt long after. A deep, guttural ache of concern. His hands, which had been instruments of unrelenting retribution, now trembled as they hovered near Julia's battered body. His eyes scanned her, searching for any signs of permanent damage. The surge of rage he had felt moments ago melted away, replaced by a visceral need to protect, to ensure she was unharmed. He gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "Baby, are you okay?" he whispered, his voice strained, raw with emotion. The storm of his fury had been quelled by the fragile reality of her condition. Julia's hand moved slowly to meet his, her fingers trembling as she clutched his palm. She nodded faintly, her breath shaky but steady. I'm fine," she whispered, though the agony she felt in her ribs betrayed the words. Her hand instinctively pressed against her belly, feeling the comforting stir of the life within her, the only reassurance she needed in that moment. Tyson's jaw clenched as his gaze shifted to the wreckage of the scene. The bystanders still gathered, murmuring and recording, their phones capturing every minute detail of the chaos. He wanted to scream, to demand justice for his wife, but the words caught in his throat. The officers, now taking Saunders away, were just beginning to comprehend the weight of the events that had unfolded. The younger cop's eyes kept darting between the fallen Saunders and Tyson, his mind clearly racing with the implications of what had just happened. But for Mike Tyson, there was no room for more words. His only concern now was Julia. "I'll take you home," he said firmly, his voice steady but thick with emotion. There was no more room for anger. The fight had been won, but the true battle was always the one he fought in silence, in moments like this. As they made their way toward the SUV, Tyson never let go of her hand, the connection between them the only tether he needed. The world could watch, the cameras could record, but in the end, this moment, their bond was what truly mattered. The storm had passed, but the echoes of justice would ring through the city for days to come. Endured. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the noise of the world outside fading into nothingness as she allowed herself to sink into his strength, the sheer weight of his protection, a balm to the raw wounds left by Saunders' brutality. Her heartbeat slowed as she felt the rhythm of Tyson's pulse, steady and sure, against her. The city, once filled with the energy of the unfolding chaos, now felt far away. Only the warmth of his embrace mattered. The violence, the terror, and even the aftermath seemed distant, as if they were part of another life, another story. Julia knew that the road ahead would be long, and there would be scars, both seen and unseen. But for now, in this fleeting moment of safety, all she could do was breathe in the comfort of his presence, his love. Mike Tyson's voice rumbled again, softer now, but filled with a deep, unwavering promise. "I'm never going to let anyone hurt you again, baby. Not like that." Her tears fell silently, but they were no longer tears of fear or pain. They were the tears of someone who had faced the edge of destruction and found herself pulled back by love, by someone who understood the fragility of life and the strength it took to protect it. She squeezed his hand, holding on as though he were the only anchor in a world that sometimes felt unrecognizable. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know." As the light continued to fade, casting long shadows across the empty streets, the couple stood together, unbroken. Behind them, the distant sound of sirens and the murmurs of the crowd slowly dissipated, leaving only the quiet hum of the city at dusk. But for Julia and Mike, the storm had passed. What remained was something far stronger, the bond they shared, forged in fire, and a promise that nothing would ever tear them apart. In that moment, Julia Tyson knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what came next, they would face it together. Silence of a moment frozen in time, where the world had paused to bear witness to a reckoning. The streets, once filled with the clamor of chaos, now seemed almost serene, the only sound the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees, and the faint echo of footsteps that followed them. But within that silence, a new story was being written, one of resilience, of a love that had withstood the fires of violence and emerged even stronger. Mike's gaze lingered on the horizon as he guided Julia toward their car, his every step deliberate, his protective instincts still sharp. He had been a force of nature in that moment, a storm of retribution for the woman he loved. But now, as they walked away, there was a quiet strength in his movements, a steadying force that wrapped around her like a shield. Julia, her body still trembling from the adrenaline of the ordeal, leaned into him, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. She knew, in the deepest part of her being, that this moment would stay with her forever. The violence, the fear, the terror, they were all fading memories, overshadowed now by the light of something far more powerful, the unbreakable bond between her and Mike. With each step, the distance between them and the scene of the confrontation grew, but Julia's heart was still heavy with the weight of what had happened. It wasn't just the physical pain she had endured, nor the terror of that brutal moment. It was the quiet fear of knowing how fragile life could be. But in Mike's arms, she found a comfort that soothed that fear. A promise that no matter what happened next, she would never face the darkness alone. As they reached the car, Mike opened the door for her, his hands steady, his gaze still unwavering. She smiled weakly, her exhaustion clear in the soft curve of her lips, but there was strength behind it. She knew they would face the road ahead, together, hand in hand, with a love that no one could break. And as the car pulled away, the city behind them slowly faded into the distance, leaving behind a story of vengeance, of survival, and of an unshakable love that had proven its power. The journey, though far from over, had begun a new chapter, one where Mike and Julia Tyson would write their own fate, undeterred by the forces that sought to tear them apart. For their love, like their bond, was unbreakable. And with that, they drove into the future, ready for whatever came next. Person, a story that would endure in the collective memory of the community, forever linked to the name Mike Tyson. It wasn't just the physical defeat of Officer Saunders that resonated, but the deeper message that justice had been served, not through the hands of the law, but through the raw power of retribution, born from the heart of a man who would do anything to protect those he loved. As the squad car pulled away, its sirens now silent, Officer Saunders sat slumped, his body battered and broken, his pride shattered beyond repair. The reality of his actions, his cruelty, his arrogance, now weighed heavily on him. His eyes, once full of the delusional confidence that came with authority, were now wide with fear and regret, unable to escape the consequences of his choices. He was no longer the enforcer of the law. He had become its victim. The city watched as he was taken away. The ripple effect of his fall felt in every corner, every neighborhood. For those who had witnessed the brutality of his actions, Mike Tyson had become more than just a boxer. He was a symbol of defiance, of standing up for what was right, of using power not for oppression, but for protection. And in the wake of his intervention, a shift had begun. A shift that would forever change the way the streets were policed, the way justice was perceived, and the way the community would stand against corruption. The story of Officer Saunders' downfall would become part of the fabric of the city, passed down through generations, retold in hushed tones and loud cheers alike. People would remember the day when Mike Tyson had stepped onto the streets not as a boxer, but as a protector, a defender of the innocent, a force of nature who had brought justice to the forefront when the system had failed to do so. As the sun set on the city, casting long shadows over the streets, a quiet resolve settled over the people. They knew, in the depths of their souls, that this was a victory not just for Julia, not just for Mike Tyson, but for anyone who had ever felt helpless in the face of corruption and abuse. And though the echoes of that fateful day would eventually fade, the impact would linger long after the sound of the squad car's sirens had died away. Mike and Julia Tyson, their bond forged through fire and pain, would drive away from the scene, leaving behind a legacy of justice, a legacy that would stand as a reminder of the power of love and the unyielding will to protect what is right. And for the rest of the city, life would go on. But they would never forget the day when a predator became the prey, and when justice had truly been served. Person to person, generation to generation, weaving itself into the fabric of the city's lore, a story of good triumphing over evil, of the power of a loving husband to protect what was precious to him. It became a tale that transcended the streets and buildings, one that reverberated in the hearts of the people, teaching them that sometimes justice needed to be brought not just by the law, but by the strength of those who would stand against the darkness, no matter the cost. In the years that followed, the name Mike Tyson was spoken with a mixture of reverence and awe, not as a boxer, not as the feared and powerful athlete who had once dominated the ring, but as a man who had used his immense strength to defend those who could not defend themselves. His actions that day, raw and unfiltered, had transformed him in the eyes of the people. He became a living legend, not for the punches he had thrown in the ring, but for the protection he had given to his family, to his wife, to his unborn child. The city, once a place of unease, began to change. The streets no longer whispered in fear of corruption, but in awe of the power of justice when it stood tall. Officers, once complacent in their power, began to think twice about their actions. The influence of that day rippled through the department. Its echoes felt long after Officer Saunders had been taken away in disgrace. And for the citizens, there was a renewed sense of hope, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, the system could be changed from within, and that the good, the righteous, would always find a way to prevail. As Mike Tyson and Julia Tyson walked away from that moment, hand in hand, they knew their journey had only just begun. The fight was not over, but they had faced the greatest challenge of their lives and come out victorious. Together, they had proven that love was stronger than fear, and that in the face of darkness, the light of justice could still shine through. And as the years passed, their story lived on, etched into the very heart of the city, a testament to the power of love, the strength of family, and the unshakable belief that good, no matter how long it takes, will always triumph over evil. Thank you for listening to the whole story. Have a good day,